Jonathan Woods. We're doing our winter tree ID program for POWWW. And our naturalist, Michael Leone, will be leading the walk shortly. So welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Your first time here, first?
No, I love you guys. Denville Community Media here on the scene, and we are going on the hike with you guys. And this is going to be awesome. You guys at POW do a wonderful job. Preserve our wetlands, water.
Protect our wetlands, water, and the woods.
And beautiful Jonathan's Woods here, which you guys have done such a wonderful job building and maintaining. And I mean, the programs you have every season, basically, right?
About once a month is our average for the public programs. And this land is thanks to us, but also the town of Denville and Morris Park Commission primarily.
And here's the group of hikers we're going to have today with us.
That's our main parking lot, Old Beach Glen Road, Fritz. And for people who saw the big pine trees, that's a civilian Corps of Engineer planting from the Great Depression in the 1920s when they put men and women to work. And that's where these pine trees came from.
They know how to treat people.
Yeah, that was a federal program. The CCC planted these pine trees.
They became known as the Cathedral Pines?
That's right. Yep. This was a government stimulus to put people back to work in the 20s throughout the country, these plantations. And they were made to harvest the timber as a product. That didn't occur, but we have some beautiful trees that are about 100 years old now.
All right, we're going to go up a little bit and take a bigger look at this. And Dave Blinder, thank you.
All right,
and we'll be following you on the trail.
Well, good morning, everybody. We've got a really nice group today, so thanks for coming. This is the POW-supported Winter Tree ID Walk. We've, I think, done this for 4 years. We usually get a pretty good turnout. This is a really nice turnout. A little bit different than the last couple of years. I think we had 1 year where it was 8 degrees and the ground was covered with ice, and last year it was 14 degrees, and we still had a good turnout, so a little bit nicer weather today. We're gonna kind of walk around and see what we've got as far as tree species here, and talk a little bit about biodiversity and why we have the walk here. The park is 650 acres approximately. We've got about 18 miles of marked trails. If you're not familiar with the park, please come back and explore. There's a lot more than we're going to cover. A very small area. We've kind of picked this area because we're really in a transition zone between the bottomland, the riparian area of the Beaver Brook, which runs out there beyond the line of pine trees, and then the low slopes here. So a riparian area is habitat that's on either side of a river. And you're going to find specific types of trees that like more wet feet. And then as you start to come up the slope, so we're right on the edge between a riparian and bottomland, which is kind of what would be near riparian, and then slope. So within this area, we have a really nice diversity of tree species, so we can get to see a lot in a short amount of space, or not too much hiking. Jonathan's Woods itself, within the 650 acres, we have 56 different species of trees, 5 of those being conifers and 1 being an evergreen, which is the American holly. So this is one of the other conifer species that was planted as part of the CCC project and the plantation. There's a whole group of them down this end. You can see these conifers that have the reddish-orange upper part of the trunk in this area. They are mixed in with white pines, but this is primarily where the red pines were planted. So that's northern red pine. that were spaced in here. Lycopodium, ground pine. This is evident in like 100-million-year-old fossils, looking identical to what it looks like now. So this is an ancient primitive plant that reproduces in a completely unique way. It produces spores similar to ferns or mushrooms, but it's not a fern, and it has a dimorphic reproductive parts, meaning that the male and female parts are on two different parts of the plant. Whereas you can see here, there's this sort of more corncob yellow structure up higher on the plant that produces a yellow kind of dusty pollen-like material, but it's different than vascular plant pollen. This is also not a vascular plant. And then down here is the receptive part that would gather the spores that fall off of the upper part onto the lower part to create also a spirochete type reproductive, and it doesn't make a seed. It reproduces without any kind of fatty tissue over the spore that they reproduce by. It's extremely primitive, self-replicating plant. Goes back hundreds of millions of years. What do we call it again? Ground pine is the common name. Latin is Lycopodium. Lyco, Lyco.
Is it ever planted as ground cover?
No, and it's very hard to establish anywhere where it doesn't just grow. If you dig it up and try and move it, it doesn't grow. Most likely because it's associated with a mycorrhizal fungus in the soil. So if you disturb it, you're not taking the associated fungal with it. You don't see a lot of swamp white oak. This is oak apple gall. Whoops, broke it. Forms on the leaf bud end of twigs, typically starting in the spring and summer. And what creates this is a tiny little native wasp. The wasp is black and purple iridescent, and probably the entire wasp isn't much more than 1/4 of an inch in size. You would miss it in an instant, but it's actually a little wasp, and it has a red thing, microscopic hair thin ovipositor on its abdomen, and that ovipositor is like a drill, and they drill into the apical stem of the growing tip, and the apical stem is almost like technically called the meristem, which is right at the very end where all the tissue is growing, where it's going to form leaf or twig or bark tissue. It's the same type of tissue in humans as stem cell, and that tissue can turn into just about anything. It's malleable, and when the wasp, turkey vulture, easily distracted. When the wasp lays an egg on the meristem tissue and that growing tip, it actually reprograms the tissue to grow differently. Just like you can do with stem cells extracted from a human, you can turn a stem cell into bone, cartilage, an eyeball, an ear. But the wasp somehow has figured out how to trick the tree into making a house for the wasp. So the tree, instead of growing a leaf out of the end of that twig like it would normally do, makes this spherical ball. And during the summer when this is growing, it's pale green, almost like Granny Apple Smith green. That's why they call it an oak apple gall. And it has kind of pink spots around it as well. So some are varying, some are all green, some have pinkish reddish spots all around the perimeter. It's hollow on the inside. You can see this, and you can see this fuzz that's in here. And this is unique because you don't often find them full of this fluff. The tree also creates this fluff. It's like cotton candy. It's sweet. When the egg hatches, into a little larval stage wasp. The whole house is already formed, and it's filled with sweet cotton candy that the tree has made to feed the wasp. So the wasp comes along, reprograms the tree, and says, build me a house for my babies. The tree builds a house. Filled with cotton candy. And the larval wasp eats the cotton candy, grows up, and when it gets big enough, now this one I didn't see, let's find one here.
A hole in it when it escapes.
There's a tiny little pinhole. This will give you an idea of the size of the wasp. You pass this one around. Wasp transforms into the larvae transforms into a flying adult wasp, gnaws a little hole in the side of the house, flies away. So this one, break that open. You may not find. Yeah.
And is that only on this species of tree?
It's on all. It affects all oaks. All oaks can get oak apple gall.
It doesn't taste like cotton.
No, it's woody. So
Apple gall.
this was one of the replacement white pines that was planted as part of the contract, and you can see sort of on the other side here. There's one, and there's these couple. But the spikier trees that are all around me are northern red pine. Those were not planted by anyone except for the seeds that came off of the adult, mature northern red pines over there, because of the prevailing wind from the north and the west, got blown in this way, and here they are 13 years later, grown literally from self-germinating seedlings. So those are totally volunteer. They, at this point, are probably outnumbering the white pine, the 2,000 white pines that were actually planted. But it gives a nice diversity because, we have red pine, white pine. There is some spruce in here as well. And early colonizer trees like the choke cherry that tend to come up in disturbed areas, birches, quite a few birch in here, Cercidophyllum, which is another tree that'll self-colonize in disturbed areas. A little hard to see Cercidophyllum, but has a heart-shaped leaf that quakes in the wind. There's a few of those up here.
Yeah, what would cause that to stop?
The last snowstorm or snow and wind. Fairly low down, you can see a twiggy nest close to the trunk. It's likely that that's a small hawk's nest. Cooper's hawk possibly makes a nest about that size, and typically makes nests that are mostly twigs. They don't do a lot of weaving, and they don't do a lot of like leaf fill in. It's just sort of a flat pile of twigs stacked up. So that's likely a small hawk's nest. We have had great horned owls nesting in here. We haven't since the blowdown, unfortunately, because I think they don't really feel like they've got enough density of canopy anymore since the interior was closed. And I don't know if anybody has ever done this, but not so strong in the winter time. peel that back and sort of sniff the broken part of that. It's smells like birch beer. This is the sweet birch. That's where we
Oh yeah, that's nice.
send those around.
Have one.
We used to boil that in Boy Scouts and make birch.
Take that.
Yeah.
Oh my.
It's really neat.
Ufa.
You can chew this.
We have a lot of these. That's kind of an odd, a different oak leaf right there. I don't know if everybody can see the shape of that, but it's kind of unique. That's a blackjack oak. Yes, he's got one in his hand. That's blackjack oak. Off the top of my head, I'd have to poke around to see where this one's coming from. Yeah, Nora's got a colossal blackjack oak leaf there. So, you know, you can just always, if you kind of look a little closer and slow down and take your time, you can really like have fun doing some botanical detective work. And that's just the 56 species of trees we have in here. We had a full survey done by a contractor a few years ago, and they identified, I think it was 800 and change species of plants in Jonathan's Woods, which includes mosses, ferns, liverworts, lichens, flowering plants, wildflowers, trees, shrubs. So 800 plus species of tree. Oriental bittersweet. It's an invasive species. Really fast growing. Birds, you can see the berries up in the top on those lateral branches. Makes red berries. Birds love the seeds and berries. They eat the seeds, they eat the berries, they poop out the seeds. Comes up everywhere. It's really difficult to control because the birds love the seeds and spread it around naturally. But unlike poison ivy and the fox grapes, the native grape, they generally don't. The two native vine species we have here generally won't smother or kill a tree, whereas the Oriental bittersweet, the invasive vine, when it gets big enough, that tree's got none of its own branches. The entire canopy there is all bittersweet plant. So that as active vine has gone up, smothered the canopy, and killed the tree. The dark vine, I'm not going to go in there because we got multiflora rose. But the dark vine that's dangling off of the black cherry tree, that's our native grapevine. And the hickory tree that we just looked at has poison ivy, and you can see because the vine is furry, those are the aerial roots, that's the poison ivy vine. So a good example of tree binding plants, two native, one invasive. They generally don't kill the trees. They will go all the way up to the upper canopy, but they never get to the level where they'll actually smother the tree. And if they do, it's seldom. Whereas the Oriental bittersweet is pretty adept at smothering trees. You see, we don't get what's called crown fires here. In the west, where you see those just devastating forest fires where the flames are shooting 80, 100 feet in the air. They're completely consuming the canopy, and the flames are twice the height of the canopy of the trees. That's called a crown fire, where the entire, tree just ignites. In the Northeast, we just simply do not get crown fires because we're mostly deciduous forest, which don't burn like conifers do. And Western forests just tend to be drier than ours, and it's all Smokey the Bear's fault. I'll do my Smokey the Bear thing once, and we won't say it again. But huge mistake to enact the only you can prevent forest fires, because when Smokey the Bear was introduced in the 1910s, I think 1910s, 19 teens, the whole idea was that forest fires were devastating. We need to suppress forest fires. We have to stop forest fires. Look at it's killing all of our forests. So 90 years of forest suppression is the direct cause of the devastating fires that we have out west, because conifer forests, all forests are fire-driven habitat. Even deciduous forests are fire-driven habitat. Deciduous forests, we get brush fires. We get understory fires. It burns out, cleans out the understory, cleans out the leaf litter, cleans out invasive species, whether it be trees or grasses, revitalizes, releases nutrients into the soil, opens up the lower canopy for grazing animals. It's nothing but beneficial to an ecosystem. If you suppress forest fires for 80 or 90 years, you get, just like what we had here, you get an incredible fuel load. That fuel load is what causes the devastating fires that are happening out west. It's an entirely human-caused situation. Thanks to Smokey the Bear and the campaign of only you can prevent forest fires. Bad idea. There's not much we can do about it now. The western forests are going to burn, whether we like it or not. And when those fires happen, they're twice as hot, 3 times as hot as if they burned on an annual, regular basis. So when the western forests burn now, it's 100% devastation. Those forests don't come back like they would if they burned every 25 or 30 years. The fires weren't as hot. All they do is they clean it, and they clean out underbrush, they clean out the understory, and the forests recover very quickly. Not all the trees die. You get reseeding. They burn in smaller patches. You never get, 200 acre, 300 acre, 10,000 acre fires like you're getting now. And when those fires run through, those fires do not recover right away because the fires are so hot, they kill everything. And they kill such a large, broad swatch that the reseeding does not occur as readily because it's just too big an area for seeds to naturally blow back in to those burned areas and revitalize the forest in any natural scale. So
the whole ecosystem gets wiped out.
We've really made a west of our western forests by the whole campaign of fire suppression.
Which is not to say Molotov cocktails.
No, because the problem is now there's too much fuel load. You do have to do controlled burning to try and thin out but with the amount of fuel load that's in western forests, whenever you get a fire, it's going to be a devastating fire now. On the East Coast, we still get fires, but they're not, again, we don't get crown fires here. It never burns up into the canopy. White pine is one of our 5 gymnosperm species, going back 600 million years, where we would actually recognize a conifer. They reproduce differently than our deciduous trees. White pines have each bundle of needles. If you were to grab this and the needles come off in individual bundles off of the twig, each bundle has 5 needles, and it's actually technically called a leaf. So these are leaves. They do the same thing as leaves do on a deciduous tree. They photosynthesize, but white pine always 5 leaves per bundle.
Yellow have 3.
Yeah, yellow pine have 3. Some have 2. So a good indicator of you're looking at a white pine when there's 5 leaves in a bundle.
Looks like you got a pretty big bag of trash going already here.
A little bit.
Well, don't pollute, give a hoot, right? Is that the message?
The convenient culture has destroyed the American landscape. Right there.
Whoa.
We're on the sound.
It's a little great day, so it's kind of hard to see those buds. Over in this direction, we'll see at the canopy little tiny balls of those are the flower buds from the red maple on the tree, the multi-trunk tree just behind. You can see how much bloom is in the canopy.
Wow.
So that's going to be a good example of an older red maple that's starting to get a scaly bark. This one is just starting to kind of go in between your smooth bark and your scaly bark. That's another red maple. Red maples very often do this at the bottom, and I think that's because they grow in wet soil, wet condition, which tends to elevate them, buttress them out of the ground. You see this, more often on red maples than any other. And we had one back there that was really elevated, it was almost on stilts, where the trunk doesn't look like it's fully anchored. So red maple, Acer rubrum, there's a group of them here. And the multi-trunk ones, actually a single trunk that can split into many. It's almost, about to bloom. That's like ready for pollinators up there right now. And then right behind us is our third maple. It's a sugar maple. It's a native maple tree, Acer saccharum, that we tap and get maple syrup out of. We are boiling our maple syrup today. We've tapped 60 gallons of sap over the last few days. And as soon as I leave here, we're going back to the maple boil. We have to boil off 60 gallons today. That usually takes 10 or 12 hours. We'll get about 5 quarts of syrup out of that. It's a big project. So
the structure, the branching structure,
yes, and the branching structure, the branches have a tendency to be more of a steep angle to the trunk, and the bark on sugar maple, very different. You'll see some better examples, but they tend to peel. Come around the back, it's actually more evident. Everyone should take a look at this. The bark peels vertically in cups. You can almost get on your finger in behind, but it's very well attached. It's not scaly or flaky. And even on large wings, the wings are always vertical, so we don't have any horizontal checking or blocking. But it peels up on the edges like this, where you can get your hand under, your fingers underneath. Sometimes those really come off quite far on older specimens. That horizontal peeling can be really dramatic, but it's always quite firm and quite well attached. It looks like it's going to come off, but it's a solid. And again, this is the cork layer, but the cork layer is quite solid on sugar maples. And if we were to drill a hole in this tree and put a spile in it, it would be coming out like a faucet, because it's a warm day. It's sugaring season. A tree this diameter, you could put at least 4 spiles into, which means you can put 4 buckets around it. You base it on diameter. You generally don't tap trees that are anything smaller than 10 inches in diameter. And as you go up in girth, you can add more spiles, because they can support a better flow. And a lot of people ask if it hurts the tree. When the spile is removed at the end of the sugaring season, the hole closes up very rapidly. We've watched them almost within a few weeks. That hole closes in and seals itself off. And they tap maple trees sometimes annually for 60, 70, 80 years, and the trees survive it. So you can drill 4 holes in this tree, and it just flows off. There's actually a lumber that's popular in Vermont and New Hampshire that you can buy from some of the, a hillside of maple trees is called a sugar bush. So if you have primarily sugar maples on a slope, they tend to grow on slopes. They call that whole little forest a sugar bush. And as the trees age out and stop becoming productive, they'll thin out the old trees to make room for younger trees. They'll lumber those maple trees, because maple is a very nice wood. It's beautiful, fine-grained wood. So when you lumber a sugar tree that's been tapped for 80 or 90 years, you're actually cutting through all of those healed up drill holes. And it makes for very interesting figuring on the boards, and that's actually called tap hole maple. that's sold as a lumber for furniture making and cabinets that has a very unique figuring simply because we've drilled it for 80 years and changed the character of the wood. You know, so it's not syrup, it's sap. It's 3% sugar by volume. So it's mostly water, and when you taste it, it tastes like water because it's only 3% sugar in a sugar maple. You can tap red maples. You can tap alder trees. You can tap black birch. The reason why we don't tap any of those commercially is because those are only 1.5 or 2% sugar by volume. So you've got to boil off a whole lot more water to get the same amount of syrup. Typically, you know, it's 30 to 1, 35 to 1. So for every 35 gallons of sap you boil off, you're going to get 1 gallon of syrup. I didn't know we had alligators. Make soup. I made and introduced, this is an old apple tree. This area we're in was owned by the Beach family. That's Old Beach Glen Road. There were multiple Beach family members that owned all the property in this area as early as the 1700s. This, for hundreds of years, was a farm. They had livestock, sheep, goats, pigs, cows, and apples. This whole lower area through here was an apple orchard. Prior to them planting the pine plantation in the 30s, this was an apple orchard run by the Beach family. These are not original apple trees from the apple orchard because apple trees only live to be 60 or 80 years old at most. But apples drop and new apple trees come up and then apples drop. So these are probably second or third generation leftover apple trees from when this was an orchard. It's a black cherry tree, pretty distinct bark, typically classified as burnt cornflakes. So that's you know how they describe the trunk of black cherry, burnt cornflakes. And very often, if you pick off the burnt cornflakes, this one seems to be losing some orange underneath. So dark gray, typically a dark trunk, lots of scale. This would be considered scaly bark. But the other thing we see pretty often on cherry trees, we look at the twigs, you'll see some kind of dark masses on the outer twigs over here. There's one right here, right over my head. See this dark mass? It's a fungal infection that is peculiar to cherry trees. If you can't identify the tree by its bark, just about every cherry tree is going to have these fungal protrusions where the bark erupts on the smaller twigs. Fungus gets into the small twigs, and then the bark erupts and it turns black. Yeah, there's a large one on there. So black cherry here. You can see all the fungal spots on the twigs, and another black cherry. Now around the back of the pollinator meadow, there's sort of a row of smaller trees that are all the same. Those are also cherries, but those are choke cherry. They get the same. If you look into the canopy, you can see those little black, kind of bumps on the twigs. But around the back there is all choke cherry. Kind of considered a weed tree, fast growing. They tend to show up whenever you clear the ground and sort of waste areas and roadsides. Choke cherries are an early pollinator species that'll come in. This area was all cleared after Hurricane Sandy. The pine trees, 16 acres of conifers blew down, and what was left is open ground, and those were the first pollinators. So those, when was Hurricane Sandy? 11 years ago?
2011.
So has 13 years ago. So those trees those are only 13 years old. You see how fast they've grown. The white pines we have here mostly. Yep, it's all white pine. Those were planted in what used to be open field. This was orchard, and the orchard was abandoned. Could have also been pasture. In the 1930s, during the Depression, the Civilian Conservation Corps, in an attempt to put people to work that were out of work, hired people to plant trees. So all over the country, there are tree plantations that were put in the 1930s by the CCC. So if we look at, I think we're going to go around back there later. These trees are all planted in rows. This is not natural, it's plantation. They were intended to be harvested in 35 or 45 years for lumber or pulp, and that's why they're planted so close together. The problem with that is they were never, a lot of the plantations were never harvested, so the trees grew too tall too fast because they were planted too close, had weak root systems because they relied on shelter from the other trees, and when Hurricane Sandy came, the trees were too tall and too weak, and they came down like dominoes. And this whole area that you see out here was all white pines, some spruce and some red pine mixed in. Norway spruce. It's mostly predominantly white pine. Down the other end there was a patch of red pine. I would imagine that, when they came to put people to work, they'd drive up with a pickup truck or a truck full of little saplings, and whatever was on the truck is what got stuck in the ground. So here's the trees, plant them. So interestingly enough, a good sort of morphology of trees. That's west and north as we're facing. Plantation was put in, all the trees grew up. 90% of our weather in this area comes in from the west and north. Our prevailing wind comes in from the west and north. Summer thunderstorms come in from the west. And so the trees on the west side of the plantation got the brunt of the weather. They were always exposed to the prevailing wind, and they grew stronger root systems, thicker trunks, and even though they were planted close together, because they were exposed to the prevailing weather over the last almost 100 years, 90 years, when Hurricane Sandy came, those didn't blow down. But the odd thing is Hurricane Sandy came in from the east. Very odd direction for a storm to hit us. The winds came in from the total opposite side. All the trees that were behind the 22 total acres of pine plantation that were here, everything behind this western northern perimeter were protected from wind for 90 years, protected all of the inner trees. All the inner trees had weak trunks, weak root systems, skinny trunks, because they never got prevailing wind. Hurricane Sandy comes in from the backside, wipes everything out, because they've never, all the trees on the east side were never exposed to those kind of winds. We had 60, 70 mile an hour gusts. When the trees started coming down, it was like matchsticks. One, it was just domino effect. Just wiped out 16 acres of the 22 acre plantation, just flattened out in one night. You've heard that all night. Yeah, just like, it was a mess, but no, that's very typical of white pine. It's typical of white pine to shed lower branches, especially because it wasn't always exposed like that. That would have been covered by more canopy. Yes. So, briefly, the stones we see here are part of the foundation of one of the Beach family barns. So there was a large barn here, and there's a pit over there. A lot of barns had where you could go in underneath, and that was accessed out to Ford Road. So I don't know if it was two structures or one structure here, but a little bit of the history of the area. The Beach farm, they were here as early as the 1700s. When we worked this area, we found a lot of very early within this area, because the barn collapsed, and when the barns were abandoned, there was probably farm equipment and plows and whatever. This is definitely hand wrought iron. You can see by the shape that this was pounded by a blacksmith. It's not a cast part. So this is pretty early. Found a lot of stuff in here. A lot of it's disappeared. There were 4 of these hinges. I have 3 of them at home this one was found most recently. The hardware is square. This is hand hammered hardware. Okay, this is very early. It's a handmade hinge. So I'm sure a barn door, there were probably 2 doors, 2 big hinges on each door. We've got all 4 hinges. This is, late 17, early 1800s hinge. Fun stuff.
What did they grow here?
Animals. Well,
dairy.
They had sheep, pigs, cows, apples. As far as field crops, we're not really aware of any field crops like corn or anything like that. It was primarily they had the fruit trees and they had livestock. It's a holly. So yeah, it's a native shrub, a valuable native shrub because the birds can eat it through the winter time. The berries come on in the fall, but they're not edible until they freeze and thaw several times, which breaks down the tannins in the berry and then makes them edible. So birds can start to eat those come midwinter and through the spring, and that's why the berries hold on there. That's Ilex verticillata. It's a winterberry, common name. Yeah, winterberry, Ilex verticillata. And it's in a holly family, even though it's deciduous. There are deciduous hollies. All hollies have the species name Ilex. Yes, the non-native multiflora rose. Right, those are the rose hips on there, which are not quite as red as the winterberry. Different species of oak here. Again, red maple, younger red maple, bullseye cankers. Smooth bark. You often see lichen on red maple too. These light gray-green patches are actually lichen, very common on red maple, but typically smooth bark, light color. Horizontal stack. This is a pin oak. A good giveaway on pin oak is it holds its branches. Branches are generally not large in diameter. It holds its branches really low down on the trunk, even in the understory canopy. You often have branches almost down to ground level on pin oak, and even when they're dead, they're really persistent. They stay on, the lower branches stay on pin oak for years and years, low down on the trunk. So it's a good giveaway. Look at the shape of the overall shape of the tree. You see, some oaks have amazing spreading canopy habit, really heavy lower branches. Like the white oak, the old white oak we saw back there, really large lateral branches, and they can get huge when they're out in the field. Those lateral branches can go almost as wide as the height of the tree. This tree's got almost no width, and it's got almost no volume to any of the side branchings. Small all the lateral branches are, all the way up to the canopy. That's the pin oak. It's typically found in wetlands. It likes wet feet. You won't find pin oak anywhere in upland regions.
Are the dark spots common for the pin oak as well?
Yeah, that's actually moss.
Okay.
Yeah. If you look closely at those dark spots, you'll find those on red maple too. It's an extremely fine, flat moss. And you can only really tell that it's a moss by looking at it with a loupe or a magnifying glass. You can see the structure, but it lays absolutely flat to the trunk.
He's right.
Looks like a moss. Anyone else? Back on our forests right now is incredible. We've never seen so many dead and dying trees of different species because there's just so many pathogens. But this species is being affected by something called birch canker. Killing them before they get too old. This one seems to be doing fairly well, except it's covered in poison ivy vine. The reason why we know it's poison ivy is because it has these hairy aerial roots. All parts of poison ivy vines, the roots, are all carry the oil that gives you the bumps and rashes and nasty effect that I don't get poison ivy, so I'll touch it. This is how you can tell the difference between American bittersweet vine. We'll point out some American bittersweet. Poison ivy always has these aerial hair roots that attaches it to the trunk. So when poison ivy goes tall enough, a lot of what you're seeing coming off laterally off of this trunk are not the branches of the birch tree. It's actually horizontal branches of the poison ivy vine. When the trunk gets big enough and it gets high enough in the canopy, the growth habit changes entirely, and it goes into what's called an arborescent phase, where it makes horizontal branches, and that's when poison ivy vine will finally flower, get pollinated, and make little berries. The birds do eat, and that's how poison ivy spreads around, but it won't do that until it's 50, 60 years old, and when it becomes arborescent, it makes horizontal branches that go laterally off the trunk. I kind of call it a tree, but a good example of a multi-trunked shrub understory. This is witch hazel. I'm not going to go through all the Latins because that'll drive everybody crazy. But what is it?
Hamamelis virginiana.
Hamamelis virginiana. It blooms in the fall. These are the bud scales from when it flowered in October, November. Makes yellow frilly flowers in a very odd time of year when you have no idea the plants would actually be blooming. But typically in October is when Hamamelis is blooming. This is witch hazel. It's used medicinally. They make astringents out of it. They do get a little bit bigger than this, but it's very often multi-trunked and doesn't get a whole lot taller than this. Understory tree, sub-tree, or large shrub. Nice native. Wood is essentially dead tissue, so this is actually the wood layer, which is deposited by the tree growing out year after year, and that's all the trails of emerald ash borer larvae that killed this tree.
Wait, why do you think it is that the ash borer only targets the ash tree, not other?
A lot of insects are host specific, and it seems totally counterproductive that any organism would kill its host. Humans get viruses that kill them. It's like, what's the productivity of a pathogen killing its host? Because once the host is dead, the pathogen doesn't really have any place to live anymore. So it's a really good question, but a lot of insects are species specific. Moths, butterflies, right down to the smallest little gnats can be specific to one or two tree or plant species as a pollinator or a host tree for whether they eat the leaves or lay their eggs on the leaves, eat pollen off flowers. So it's very common to have very close association between insects and plants. Let's look at the canopy of what we got here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's a couple of short ones, but there's this one particularly large one. Has an interlacing bark pattern. Looks almost like an ash tree. Looks very similar to an ash tree. But the canopy caught my attention, and there's only these 5 trees right here. And I've looked around, tried to find others in the area, but these kind of puzzled me for a minute. I had to do a little bit of, kind of looking around and poking around. It's a chinkapin oak. Never seen or known chinkapin oak to be in this park before, but the leaf is the dead giveaway. So this is, most people doesn't really recognize this as an oak leaf. We have willow oaks that have a leaf that looks like a willow tree. So there's a wide variety of oak leaf shapes, but there's no points. It's a smooth edge. It's vaguely similar to chestnut oak, but distinct enough that this puts the canopy branching structure really distinguishes it from chestnut oak. We'll see chestnut oak down the line a little bit, and we can pick up and compare leaves. But these 5 trees here are chinkapin oaks, and I just found these the other day, and was kind of surprised that I'd never really noticed them before. So every time you go out, if you pay attention and you're looking at stuff, you'll find something new.
What is it
Yeah, absolutely native.
What is it exactly in the canopy that you're seeing?
So I'm seeing a very, very fine branch structure. You can kind of, if we look behind us at any of the other canopies here, you can see how different, how finely laced the twig structure is up there.
And you might pass by and just assume it's an ash, but then you say, wait a second, it's not dead.
Yeah,
It's not dying.
and ash trees, when we look at the canopy of these ash trees probably have about the coarsest canopy of any of the trees. They're always, the ash trees, the branches tend to always go up at a very steep angle to the trunk. Branches don't go out horizontally on ash trees. They're always very, very steep angled to each other and coarsely branched. So this canopy here, that canopy there, that's ash, this one behind us that has the blonding, the one that you just looked at that has all the, the borer marks on the trunk. You see the difference in the canopy and the angle that the branches come off of the trunk.
There are, just very quickly,
Yeah.
2 great books you may want if you're interested in learning how to ID trees. Bark, which allows you to identify by the bark and the twigs, so in the winter this is very useful. And of course the David Sibley Guide to Trees is a very good one for the illustrations of the flowering tree.
This smoothing of the bark here on this white ash is a sign that the tree has already been infected with the emerald ash borer, and this is called blonding. It's the indicator that this tree is already too far gone to save. And you can look at the canopy; it's already losing branches. But this is another example of what's called interwoven, where the ridges, you have ridges and furrows, but the ridges and furrows crisscross each other, creating diamond shapes in between. So it's a good indicator of ash trees. Here's another ash tree. And most likely, this one's in pretty good shape. You can see a lot that are already completely gone and dying.
This is a hickory?
Yep, we'll talk about hickory since we're standing here. Pick up a couple of nuts. So, shagbark hickory here, shagbark hickory to the right, behind north, and then a young shagbark hickory. So we have a little group of shagbark hickory. If we look up at the canopy, you can see that the branching is a little bit more coarse. Twigs, especially if you look at like the lower branches here. Very coarse twigs, not a lot of fine twigging, and even right out to the end of the branch, the twigs are fairly thick. So you don't have a finely dissected canopy when it comes to branching. And if you look around on the ground, shagbark has a really thick outer husk. So the nut is maybe a little bit smaller than a golf ball in size. That's the green part of the nut when it's growing. That flakes off in 4 segments. So they're put together like this, goes around, splits apart in 4 segments, exposes an inner nut, and then inside of that is actually, so this is a intermediary shell. When you see these, they have, I don't know if I put a good one in my pocket. They often will have 4 ribs down the side, and they're fairly round in shape. So that's one of the 2 species of hickory that we'll see along here. We've got 3 in the park. There's mocker nut hickory grows down in the bottomland off of the Orange Trail. Those nuts are really large. They're like the size of a tangerine almost, but there's almost nothing inside. So shagbark hickory has a much thicker outer husk, and when we get to the pig nut hickory, we'll point those out. So again, marcescent teacher holding on to the leaves. This is American beech tree. Pull a twig off of this. Pretty easy to identify. It's one of the only few trees that has smooth bark throughout its entire life phase. No matter how big a beech tree gets, it's always going to have smooth bark. It never gets scaly, never gets any kind of ribs or furrows.
People love to carve their initials in them.
Yeah, has very little evidence of lenticels. Lenticels we'll point out later. That all trees have lenticels. They're little pores on the surface that help the trunk exchange gases, take in oxygen and let off CO2. But another really good indicator of beech trees is the buds at the end of the twigs in the winter are very cigar-shaped.
Based on the diamond-shaped pattern and the fact that it's dead.
It's an ash.
It's an ash tree.
Yeah, so it's a white ash. Yeah, there's a lot of very technical terms for the layers of bark. There's 4 or 5 different layers. The outermost layer that we'll wait for the noisy truck. So the outermost layer that we see on top is called the cork layer. It's the only layer that's actually dead. This isn't doing anything. It just tends to kind of spread apart and flake off and be replaced from underneath, just like our skin is. Cork layers vary in thickness from almost non-existent on the beech tree to inches thick. Yeah, chestnuts, walnut trees. Yeah, cork trees. It can be really thick, especially on older trees. But on a lot of trees in between the furrows, where it cracks apart, you can actually see sort of a light orange or light yellow layer. If you were to scrape that away, that's sort of a transparent layer that is still active, live tissue underneath the cork layer. If you scrape through that, you will get green and see chlorophyll. So they're only getting sunlight to shine just between the cork layers. There's no light that's going to come through this dead layer of cork. The problem with bats is that unlike they're not rodents, they're mammals. So they nurse their young, like a rodent does, but they only have one pup rather than a litter. Rodents can reproduce when they're 3 months old and have 8 or 9 or 10 pups at a time every 3 months thereafter for their whole 2.5 years of their life. Bats can live 30 or 40 years. But they don't reproduce until they're 5 years old. So they have to survive for 5 years before they reproduce for the first time, and they have one pup. Wow. So that's the problem with bats recovering. It's very, very slow reproductive rate. Mm-hmm. So the bat cave down the line, up the line, at one point I think was surveyed to have over 3 million hibernating bats of 5 different species. Wow. And after the white nose syndrome kind of was finished, they were counting under 1,000. Under 1,000 of only 2 species. Mm-hmm. So at this point, the population has stabilized and is the numbers are up above 1,000. Okay. That's it. But from 3 million to 1,000, it's precipitous. So you got mature reproducing females only having 1 pup a year. It's going to be hundreds of years before you're back at 3 million bats. Mm-hmm. It's just do the math. It just does. It's not in their favor. But
what kind of birds do those houses host?
Those are what we call superfluous bat boxes.
Okay.
There's a group that puts them up all over the place on poles. I don't know who exactly they are. Some scout groups actually put them up, but bats don't use them because they're too cold. If you put a bat box just like that on the south side of your house up against a structure, they'll use it. But if you put it on a pole out in the middle of a field, you won't find bats in there. In the summertime, they may roost in there temporarily, but the whole idea of these things is to give year-round shelter, winter hibernaculum, and they don't use them because they're too cold. So So they should just be putting these up on people's houses. They should be asking people, do you want to put one of these up on the south side of your house? Then the bats would use them. But, so that's why we call them superfluous bat boxes. People have not done their homework.
Thank you. Wow.
Great job, man.
Cultivation. Great hike.